Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming. This video is part 5 of the recap series of the Dark Ages Vampire Chronicle that I have been running over the past few months. In the last video, you may recall that the coterie of satraps had just recently resolved the political situation in Ely, appointing the Ventrualis Upland as Lord, sending the Salubri Bethany, the heretic/prophet, to Sarum to set up her own domain down there, away from any political unrest, and under the watchful eye of Hyle once he returned. And they were all due to leave in order to carry on heading to the northeast, Lindisfarne, where they would meet up with the Salubri Matthias in order to gauge, on behalf of Roger de Camden, whether it was worth the while of the baronies of Avalon to ally with Clan Salubri rather than Clan Tremere, or vice versa, as en route returning they were due to drop in, essentially, on the Lion's Gate Chantry in Durham and gauge the Tremere response to such an offer. Although, to do so, they would have to be circumspect, as the Tremere would certainly not truck with the satraps of Mithras, given that Mithras has, in no subtle way, said that the Tremere are not welcome in the British Isles and should be punished with final death on sight. So that is where we are. The coterie were just due to leave Ely when Tobias, our Nosferatu, noticed that his paramour, his vessel, his blood dole, his human of choice, the nun Catherine that he had liberated from the burning convent in Huntingdon, had gone missing. You may recall that the coterie were holing up in a temple of the Order of Hermes on the middle of a bridge that was seemingly invisible to mundane eyes. While that was the case, whilst the coterie were dealing with a political situation, their mortal servitors were left unguarded, and it would seem, based on the use of auspex from Sylvanus and Lady Cheyenne, that someone had come and snatched her, taken her away. Tobias has kind of fallen in love with this lady, although the feelings are certainly not reciprocated, only because she was the first person to really show him any kindness, and that was whilst he was obfuscated to look infinitely more handsome than his bug-like form actually is. So he requested humbly of the rest of the coterie that they see whether they can rescue Catherine from the Magi before they leave. Sylvanus warned against it, as he had made a deal on behalf of the coterie that the Order of Hermes, the House Flambeau, who owned this little temple, would be able to do whatever they liked in exchange for the coterie's safety. However, Tobias was resolute, and so they followed the trail to a house that looked quite, well, uniform, quite mundane, white walls, thatched roof. Each side of it was bordered by another house of similar structure. No windows, but a door. And upon trying to open the door, Tobias found that it was jammed, almost as if warded magically. Now, I won't lie, I did say to the group at some point before this that some creatures in the world of darkness are more powerful than your vampires. That's where the challenge comes in. However, the coterie perhaps have developed a feeling of immunity given their recent successes, and so Lord Hyle decided he'd use his potence on the door and basically smashed it open. The thing that they saw on the inside, well, the floor was a thick white sand, the ceiling was a roiling sea of flame, and all around the chamber, for it was one large chamber, were torches burning with a hot blue fire. In the centre of it, an old man sat in the sand, his legs crossed, and seemingly he was in a meditative pose, or trance, shall we say. Sylvanus identified immediately this was some kind of mage, and they were about to intrude on his chantry. Nevertheless, Lord Hyle and his child Coraline decided to advance in to demand the return of their mortal vessel. The old man's eyes flicked open, and he demanded that they leave. He commanded that they leave. They refused. As I say, they had a certain feeling of immunity about them, I think, at this point. Now, to you, the viewer, I can say that this is Ars Magica territory. This isn't Mage the Ascension. Magi are certainly not as weak or restricted, not that they're weak in Ascension, as they will be, as when the magic is still strong, as in the Dark Ages. This guy is a form of a Merlin, I suppose, and so when he commanded, the vampires felt scared, and yet they held their ground. They held their ground not just against him, but against the roiling sea of flame in the ceiling that could have snuffed any of them out at any point. Lady Cheyenne came upon a fantastic idea. Why not use her celerity to rush around the room and snuff out all of the torches, at least cast them to the sandy floor, so as to lessen the danger. Our Lindisfarne at this point were deeply shaken. After all, they are not at all comfortable in the presence of heat, fire, or light. Much like dry timber. The old mage again commanded they leave. Again, they refused and said they would not leave without their mortal. He explained that she had been claimed for the purifying eternal flame of House Flambeau, that they had sensed something of an aspirant in her, a spark of magic. She was theirs. The coterie weren't budging, at which point the old man, his hand filled with a stave, a staff, of what appeared to be just old wood. He gave them one last warning. Lady Cheyenne decided at this point that she would grapple the old man for his staff. If she took it from him, perhaps he would be powerless. Using her celerity, she certainly ran up to him faster than he could do much. She certainly grabbed the staff before it could let out any kind of bolt of magic. However, what her grabbing it did achieve from this mage of House Flambeau, this pyromaniac wizard, was the turning of the staff into a pillar of flame that, of course, the mage was immune to, and Lady Cheyenne most definitely was not. From her fingertips all the way up to her shoulders, she burst into a glorious flame and went tearing out of the house. This was enough to break the wills of, well, Lord Hyle. Lady Coraline was somehow able to resist, but Lord Hyle likewise went in a fit of roach schreck and tore through the town of Ely. Now, I don't need to remind you, I'm sure that in Ely right now is the bishop and regent to the throne of England. There is a heavy proto-Inquisition presence there. Things that are not kind to vampires that run through the streets on fire or screaming or waving their axes around. Hyle's recourse was to run to his brother Daniel's haven, where Daniel plunged him into a room of complete darkness and essentially stroked his head and told him, there. He gave him the kind of succour and sanctuary that a Lindisfarne needs, just pitch blackness. And after feeding him some drops of blood to calm him down, that seemed to do the trick. Lady Cheyenne was less fortunate. She actually had to dive into the river Great Ouse in order to douse the magical flames on her arms. It wasn't enough to prevent them from being burnt down to cinders. They had very little use left in them, and she went off floating down the river afterwards, pretty much in torpor, where she was fished out by her ghoul, David, and the rest of the coterie, just as they decided to leave Ely. So, we had a bit of an interesting event with the Inquisition starting to light their fires, with these holy men sensing that there was something unnatural and evil tearing through their streets, and they were willing to do anything to rout them. So the coterie left at some speed, those ones that were still awake or alive enough to do it. En route, it became apparent that Lady Cheyenne was in desperate need of blood in order to recover any semblance of what was left of her arms. And Lord Hyle had lost face in front of the rest of the coterie. He had been effectively the commander without requesting as such for the last few months, and he had just panicked. He had panicked like a neonate in Roachtrek in front of the rest of his coterie. The rest of the coterie did bolt from House Flambeau, but they did so in a more controlled fashion rather than tearing through the street. So the coterie was shattered to some degree. They travelled 2 or 3 nights en route to Bishop's Lynn without meeting anyone on the road until they found a solitary farmhouse set back a way, and deciding that they would be merciless, they found the old man that lived within, his wife long dead, and they killed him in short order, draining him of blood. In fact, it was Coraline's first kill, wanting to prove herself to her sire. She just snuffed the old man's life out, showing that she could be a perfectly adequate La Sombra. The Nosferatu Tobias, still mourning the loss of his chosen mortal vessel, he rescued some chickens from outside the back of the old man's house and basically smuggled them into his cloak, attempting to use some form of animalism that he didn't actually have, his animal ken, in order to soothe them. He was just desperate for companionship at this point. Sylvanus looking at the chicks hungrily, more just to prove a point, rather than actually wanting to drain them of blood. He was quite desirous of destroying those chicks if he had the opportunity to do so. Eventually, the coterie reached Bishop's Lynn, and Bishop's Lynn they already knew to be a lupine stronghold, a town in which the werewolves ran the place much like vampires run one of their domains, and so they knew not to go in. Now, I had accounted for the idea that they may well go to a nearby village, get a rowing boat from there, and manage to find a ship at Bishop's Lynn by approaching from the sea. But instead what they decided to do was slowly stalk their way around the circumference of Bishop's Lynn, which resulted in werewolves who were able to sense the worm. At this point, by the way, they had already sent David in order to secure a ship, David being Lady Cheyenne's ghoul. He had come back with the meat pretty much sucked off of his fingers, the werewolves doing so to prove a point, and infecting him with a malady that hasn't yet been quite understood. And yet he was able to secure a ship. So, yes, they decided they would make their way around the town whilst being catcalled, cajoled, generally goaded by the werewolves, who respected their own territory, and essentially these young pups weren't going to get in a fight with these ancilli vampires as much as just generally piss them off, maybe shove them about a bit. And if the vampires attacked, then certainly the werewolves would rip them limb from limb. But until that point, as long as they didn't tread on their turf, the werewolves would restrict themselves to waving their genitalia in the vampires' general direction. And so that's what they were doing, stalking along the city walls, watching the vampires as they made their rather, well, shall we say, pathetic walk, looking down at the ground, trying to avoid all the goading, trying to avoid all the catcalling of the werewolves who were just grabbing their crotches, calling them out as leeches, baring their buttocks, firing arrows at their feet, doing everything short of actually getting in a fight with them. Two of the pups, especially brazen and bold, decided they would attack the coterie, at which point the rest of the coterie bolted for the ship, but Hyle and Coraline stoically carried on walking. They were striding. They would not be cowed by these base savages. So yes, one of them, Lord Hyle, was shoved by one of the werewolves. Lord Hyle, before deciding to shove back, decided on an impressive course of action. I'm not sure the rules would actually allow for it, but I liked the description to such a degree that I allowed it. Essentially, he grabbed Coraline and, using his 4 points of potence that I believe he has, he bounded. He basically used his strength to leap through the air, away from the werewolves before anything more could happen, and towards the ship, and managed to scale the side of the ship and knock one of his silver-tipped arrows. If you recall, he melted down one of de Camden's silver goblets earlier in the Chronicle in order to make the silver tips for these arrows, and fired it back at the werewolves. The Danish crew of the ship had pretty much no idea what was going on, but knew better than to get into a fight with what appeared to be rabid beast men, and so they unmoored and, if that's the word, and set sail, or set row, on their their Viking out to the sea. They do have a sail, actually, Nars, I think. They can do. Narrowly avoiding an entire town full of werewolves. Now, I make no joke, if the coterie had actually made their way into Bishop's Lynn and tried to reach the ship by going straight through, then they would have, well, met a very bad end. Lady Cheyenne was still pretty much torpid by this point, and by the time they arrived in South Berwick, just south of Lindisfarne, having passed Novum Castellum, Scarisborg, and various other anciently named places like Newcastle and Scarborough, Middlesbrough, they landed at South Berwick, and Lady Cheyenne was hungry. Many of the coterie had just decided to remain torpid on board the boat. Upon arriving in South Berwick, as well as finding himself a new suit of armour, which is what Lord Hyle decided to do, he found the nearest tanner and decided he would get a decent suit of tanned leather. Cheyenne and Sylvanus decided that they would go on a blood binge, waiting until the dead of night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe 3. They found some boatmen just dragging their boat ashore, obviously on a late night fishing trip, their nets full of fish. Clearly they had scored quite a haul and would have been praised in the village of South Berwick had they arrived back. It was not to be for these fishermen, for Lady Cheyenne approached them in her sultry, toreador way, and then, pushing her points into her 3 points of celerity, ripped throats out with great aplomb, and as fishermen tried to leave, they tried to flee. Sylvanus, silent, deadly, hiding in the shadows, decayed those fishermen as they fled, or at least parts of them, stopping to feed and binge on the rest of these fishermen. They drained every last drop from these poor hapless sods, to the point where when they woke the following night, their abdomens were swollen, like a leech or tick might be swollen. It was spherical, hanging over the waistband, like a bubble of blood waiting to be popped, a blister. They had never felt it before. They felt ill, they felt like they needed to disgorge, and so they did. A torrent of blood, undigested, not turned into vitae, evacuated from their mouths, and the rest of the coterie had to resist to not just lap it up from the floor. Though I know this isn't a rule. This is a little feature I add to Vampire. I don't like feeding to just be another meal. I like there to always be a cost to it. So the players, playing Sylvanus and Cheyenne, did go to the trouble of pushing the boat back out to sea, putting the bodies in it, and decaying the ones that they decided weren't worth it, so it would look like the fishermen were lost at sea. That was very clever, but indulging to the degree that they did, I felt was perhaps an overreach, and was the kind of thing that should be punished through plot, and that's why come the following night they woke up like mosquitoes full of blood, just bulbous sacs hanging from them. This much blood could not be contained by their undead frame, and so they had to regurgitate it in a most horrific fashion, reminiscent of the time that I got particularly drunk on red wine. The rest of the coterie were less than impressed, although, being able to rest again en route to Lindisfarne, Lady Cheyenne started to make something of a recovery with the amount of blood that she had imbibed. When they reached Lindisfarne and the castle there, the monastery rather, where Matthias makes his domain, they came upon a very interesting and quite alarming sight indeed, for it was the scene of a great night battle. They had arrived just in time, and in fact they had actually arrived just in time by my game clock. If they had arrived the night before, they would have been there for when the battle launched when the opposing force launched its siege on the monastery. But no, they arrived with the enemy having their backs to the arriving coterie. And what happens next will be detailed in the next video. Who is attacking the salubri? What are those flying beasts in the sky? Who are these mortals valiantly defending the vampire, who atop the monastery seems to be practicing some foul art, draining a green ichor from these flying stone creatures, making them smash to the ground in rubble? What is going on in Lindisfarne, and will Matthias be the salubri that they are expecting? Thank you very much for watching.